Next, it is time for our keynote speeches, and as you can see, we are joined by numerous distinguished scholars from home and abroad today, and we're going to hear from two outstanding keynote speakers this morning. And I'm very glad to announce that the first keynote speech will be delivered by Professor Robert E. Hall from Stanford University, who is also serving as a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. So without further ado, let me invite him over to the podium. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Okay, so my plan here, first of all, I'm very delighted to have been selected to give this keynote talk. I'm going to try to reward you with maximally controversial remarks, intentionally so. So much so that I do invite interventions. Greg Kaplan has already agreed to perform one intervention because I gave him a preview last night and he was so upset. He insisted that I didn't have it right. Okay, so what am I going to try to say? It's that one relatively straightforward type of analysis embodied in a very simple model is capable of explaining with respect to the U.S. economy, and I think for other economies, but it's always been my position that the U.S. economy is sufficiently complicated that it's the best I could do to understand it. So I make no claim to say that the same thing applies elsewhere, but I've pretty intensively studied the U.S. Economy. So the numbers that I'm going to talk, starting with this slide, are all from the U.S. The basic idea is that you don't need to know anything about a lot of stuff, especially the subject of this conference, monetary policy. What I'm going to talk about is sort of the background for monetary policy of the evolution of the real economy. This is an outgrowth of the so-called real business cycle model, which says, let's take a growth model and add sources of fluctuations apart from monetary policy and see how far it goes. This is very much an exercise in how far can you go. That was, I think, the intention of the first real business cycle models. Just to give you a forecast of where this is headed, there's two changes from the classic model, real business cycle model. One is to pay attention to a driving force not previously considered, which goes by many different names. I'm using the term confidence here, but others have called it sentiment. It's the subject in particular of the famous chapter 12 of Keynes' General Theory. So this is an attempt to bring Keynesian thinking that's not affiliated with the idea of sticky prices. I've always been an opponent of making sticky prices be the centerpiece of macro. Now, I know that's completely heretical in this audience, which spends a great deal of its time necessarily, I think, looking at sticky price models. And that's fine, but it's just not what I do. And what I'm trying to do here is to look at a single potent driving force and see how far it takes us. It's not a claim, I have to say, that you can't bring in other factors to a complete story. So the model that I'm going to present here briefly, mostly in terms of results, is I understand, a considerable oversimplification. But I think it's an important lesson. So the basic idea is that something happens. Something happened in particular on September 15th, 2008, radiating out from Wall Street. They got people scared, seriously scared. So scared that the weight that they gave in making investment and other plans was diminished. So that's going to be modeled in a very simple way here, and one not original here, but widely used in the related literature, and that is to have preferences that become myopic as a result of a crisis. Now you might say, okay, why? Okay, I don't know. I want to be very clear. I don't know. This is not me competing with Mario Sangelettos and others who have worked very hard on trying to build models of it. I'm a reader of that literature, not yet at least a contributor to the literature. So I'm going to take the starting point as something happens, which very clearly happened in September of 2008. And it's revealed, most reliably in terms of measurements, revealed in the stock market. So one of the plans here, and this is not the first paper I've written on this subject, but I'm going to focus on this one. The stock market fell by about 50% very soon after the Lehman shock. And we know from finance research that such a change occurs not because there was a similar reduction in what shareholders thought they would get in terms of dividends or other sources of value from holding shares. It's entirely because of the application of higher discount rates. So I'll actually go through a bit of that research in a modern form. There is no possibly stronger confirmation of the ideas of finance that were nicely summarized in John Cochran's presidential address to the AFA in 2014. The financial developments in the U.S. tracked out those ideas perfectly. So I'm going to show you a picture and that's amazing because that's an econometric relationship that was uncovered in the mid-1980s, resulted in it's a very simple regression model. Every regression model that I've worked on and everyone that I've read about previously falls apart later. Like the Phillips curve is a perfect example. You run the Phillips curve, it looks great. Then you run it with data for the last decade, it's just not there. But here, this idea in finance is really, really successful and durable. And that is that when you see the stock market fall, it means that discounts have risen. And those are discounts that are applied in making economic decisions in the economy. So this picture shows the things that, some of the things I'm going to be looking at here. It shows this tremendous decline in the stock market, the blue line. I don't have any way of pointing to this, and there's two screens, but you can see the blue line. Luckily, they're different colors. And then investment in plant and equipment declined very rapidly on the same track. Consumption declined, as you can see, and that's something that's received a lot of attention, but not by that much. The huge effects in the market are those that are very specifically involve, do I do something now that I could pretty easily do later, like installing plant and equipment? And the other one I'm going to emphasize is hiring, because we'll see the same thing happen to hiring. So there was a shock in the economy, a discount shock that caused the stock market crash. It's not that the stock market crash was the causal source. It's just another endogenous variable that reflects the change in the sudden development of myopia, unwillingness to do things now whose benefit would be in the future. There's some of that logic is required in consumption, but as you can see, it's just not as powerful. So one comment I would make is that the huge amount of research that's gone into trying to understand consumption from the point of view of cash flows in households, I think is important, but I don't think it's at the center. I think that what's at the center in what happened is the increase in impatience, myopia, or failure of confidence, or diminished sentiments, whatever you call it. There's that idea that you can read very much about in Chapter 12 of the General Theory. Okay, so that's the basic framework. So the idea here is to try to convince you that the real business cycle is something worth looking at with the main amendment that I just went over. The secondary amendment that the real business cycle didn't know anything about unemployment, and that's been followed by a shocking neglect of unemployment in modern macro. But fortunately, we have a coherent theory of unemployment. You can plug that in. So this is real business cycle theory with large changes in confidence, modeled as myopia, and with the fact that when things go bad, incentives to create jobs decline because of myopia, perceived incentives, that's going to result in a large bulge. Unemployment reached 10% in the U.S., which is a very high level. Unemployment today is 3.8%, so it's extremely high. It was not high by international standards, but it's certainly high by domestic standards. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about Campbell-Schiller. Campbell-Schiller, I think, is the centerpiece. I should also say Fama French, who wrote a very important paper at the same time. But for some reason, Campbell-Schiller tend to get a little more credit for it, even though it's in Fama French. But here it is. And that says that you can map the stock price level on the horizontal axis to the discount. And a fundamental theorem of finance says that discounts equal expected returns. So when the stock market declines, the expected return rises. That's econometrically what's shown here. This is just amazingly strong confirmation of that idea. It's absolutely fundamental idea. I think it's underrated in macro. So it's something I'm pushing very hard. So there it is. And these dots, which are just annual observations on expected returns measured from the correlation with realized returns. And the line shows that the expectation, and the dots are the actual returns. Returns skyrocketed. Anyone who invested in the stock market after it went down by 50% enjoyed a 50%, since the stock market's back to where it was, enjoyed a 50% extra return. And this very powerful proposition only makes sense in the Campbell-Schiller world. So there's going to be a Campbell-Schiller shock that lies behind, and it's a measurement of something that's happening. It's not an exogenous causal event. It's a reflection of the change in attitudes about whether to make an investment now that has a return in the future, and whether or not you're overcome by the sense of myopia that seems to go with a financial crisis. Okay, so I mentioned that another aspect of what happens when discounts rise is that unemployment rises. Now, I just published a paper last year in the AER that pushed this idea hard. And since it's not easy to get a paper published in the AER today, someone saw merit in it besides me. And there are pictures like this, the slide here, which shows that the employment rate, which is just 1 minus the unemployment rate, employment went down at the same time that the discount rate went up, and then as the discount rate came back to normal, unemployment went back to normal. Now, I'm going to say not that the stock market then caused this. I'm going to say the same recovery from the myopia, the sudden surge of myopia that resulted in unwillingness to create jobs and therefore more unemployment, is something that happened. And as views about the future came back to normal, and that's along the lower line, the green line, unemployment came back to normal. When the economy is back to normal today, we have normal views about the future. This is now all in the past. So that's the basic idea, that spending on durables, consumer durables, and producer durables collapsed. Spending on employment collapsed, all as a result of the increase in impatience and the rise in the discounts that were applied by decision makers. That's the unified idea. That's the only thing you need to know about why the U.S. economy went through turmoil as a result of Lehman and the very large increase in discounts that were triggered by the events in Lehman. Anything more about the causal factors, I'm not trying to explain. I'm reading that. When Tom and I were undergraduates together, we read chapter 12 and we were impressed by it. And this is an attempt to say that's not just important; it's everything about the result of a wave of doubt about what's going to happen to the economy, an increase in discounts that goes with that. Everything about that is all you need to know to understand why GDP fell, why unemployment rose. All those things result entirely from this development of impatience. And other things you may have heard about. Zero lower bound, not a factor in this discussion. Of course, it's something that affects the real economy, but I think it's secondary. What really matters is this idea. Okay, so that gives rise to a modeling challenge. So I'm going to talk about how you model this, and you'll see this evolves as a straightforward real business cycle model with these two major additions, both of which, one of which gives it all its volatility. That's the notion that there are factors that bring in myopia and perturb the economies from that source, so that's the driving force. And the other is getting a theory of unemployment. You cannot do macroeconomics without understanding unemployment. And there's just a remarkable amount of research done today that doesn't understand unemployment, even denies that unemployment is worth talking about. So part of this mission, and I've been on this mission for a long, long time, is to try to get unemployment back into macro. Not in the silly idea that unemployment is the gap between labor supply and labor demand, but a Gary Becker theory of unemployment, which is what's embodied here. One that considers unemployment to be a useful application of time for which there's variation that's driven, in particular by variations in discount rates. Okay, so here's the development. I'll go through this quickly. Of a real business cycle model, off-the-shelf real business cycle model with these two important alterations. So all this is standard. So anyone with any PhD level exposure to the macro has seen this. And it's a tribute to the power of the real business cycle model that it is at the core. It's at the core of DSGE models that central banks use. It's at the core of the model that the Congressional Budget Office uses. There's a lot of really good ideas, a lot of which come from Robert Solow. So that part, not going to change that part. So some basic ideas they're not going to change. Tobin's Q, to understand the fluctuations in investment spending, which are central to this process, you need to understand investment. And that's a matter of combining the two great ideas of investment of the 20th century. That's Tobin's analysis of investment adjustment costs, which generates Tobin's Q, which is central to understanding in this model how the stock market can change. The stock market is equal to Q times K. That's an identity that is imposed upon everyone in the real business cycle business. It's perplexed a lot of people. So you got to get lots of volatility in Q to make this theory work. So that's done here. And the other is Jorgensen. Jorgensen associated the user cost of capital, first order condition, demand for the capital services. You have to combine these two ideas. That's central to getting a coherent theory of investment, and that's an equation in this model that generates a collapse of investment, along with the collapse in Q. And the collapse in Q actually is the way the model incorporates the collapse of the stock market, because the stock market, the value of the stock market is simply the value of all the stuff that the corporations traded in the stock market own. It must be Q times K. Making that work is another topic that I worked on. But that's how the stock market is modeled here. Consumption, it's pretty standard now, although there's interesting elaborations of this, but it turns out for this purpose that it works fine to put in just a standard intertemporal Euler equation analysis. And that has a capacity, because it's got R, which is the discount rate, in it to generate fluctuations in consumption. So there are fluctuations in consumption. In fact, it somewhat overstates those fluctuations relative to what actually happens. And finally, the labor market, and this is standard, this is a simplification, but I think it's a simplification in the right direction of the Diamond, Mortons, and Pisaridis theory of unemployment. That's the Gary Becker theory of unemployment. It's a theory in which there's a purposeful use of time, there's a marginal value of the purposeful use of time and the marginal cost, and you equate them. It's the right way to do economics, right? It's not gapology. This is fighting all the time with gapology. Gapology says that unemployment is just the difference between labor supply and labor demand. What does that mean? No one knows what that means. DMP tells you what it means. It's the right way to think about unemployment. And unemployment is first order important. It's first order important when some influence changes the unemployment rate from 5% to 10%. In the model, that is effectively a 5% reduction in labor supply. It's very important to understand in the DMP model that the household is a unemployment rate taker. Suffering a certain amount of surge is effectively a tax on working that in that model. And then when you do the Becker analysis, that generates a lower equilibrium amount of work. Now, it turns out that most of this story, it's not quite as dramatic, most of the story does survive if you say, well, I don't believe that. Almost all macroeconomists say, I've heard about DMP and I've been meaning to study it, but I haven't done that yet. I've been pushing very hard against that, trying to get it more into the mainstream of macro. Okay, so the present value. This model is set up as a set of differential equations in time, which is a very easy way to set it up. So everything is expressed as a differential equation, but this is just a way of writing down a present value, and that present value, called J in every version of this model that I know, determines the value. Determines the payoff to the employer to create a job. So it goes. That then feeds directly into this analysis. And J sets the incentive to create jobs and therefore sets the unemployment rate. That's straightforward. You have to read the paper or other papers like my recent AER paper to see that further. But the key point here is that J is a present value. It's a present value whose value is declining, or declines, when everyone gets afraid that maybe the future isn't going to work out the way they thought, and they apply a higher discount rate. You can measure J directly out of government data. This is a fascinating fact. There's a survey which reveals the time it takes to fill a job, and that number is proportional to J. So you can read a financial number out of the jobs report once a month. We know a financial number. So it makes this analysis. So you can read my AER paper if you want to see that idea further, but it's built in here. Okay, so all right. So now here's the key question. There's something that happens in the economy modeled as a increase in this variable rho, which is the flow counterpart. It's like a continuous. It's what Paul Samuelson called the force of interest. What happens in a crisis is that it jumps up and then it follows this adjustment equation back to normal. But that appears only one place in the model, and that's in the Euler equation that's applied by investors to figure out how much they weigh their own consumption in the future. The model has to interpret that, has to relate rho, which is treated as the driving force, exogenous, into R, which is the market discount rate. Making that connection is actually the hard part of this kind of analysis. It's very easy to write down a model in which other things happen so flexibly, in particular investment happens so flexibly that that nothing happens to R when rho changes. It just changes the rate of change of consumption. So if you look at the Euler equation. Okay, so you have to read the paper to follow that. But so one of the hard things in this line of research, it's taken me 5 years to overcome this problem. But now I think I've got it. So rho jumps a bunch. R jumps, not as much as rho does, because there is some of this consumption, rate of change of consumption absorbing that. But that's the link, and having that link is crucial. It would be kind of vacuous to make R the market, which is a market phenomenon, be a driving force. You need a driving force that's rooted in fundamentals. So that's done here. And it's done in other work, too. I should say that I'm not the only one who has such a driving force. Okay, parameters. So I'm almost out of time. Okay, so now we'll just put that on the computer, and MATLAB will do its magic. So here's what happens. First of all, the jagged blue line is the financial discount rate. The red line is what the model's doing, so it captures it. It's not as good at doing the stock market, so that requires some more work. The stock market should have fallen about 20%, according to this model. It actually fell 50%. So we'll work on that. The employment rate is about right. It's not, the dynamics aren't right yet, but there's other things going on. But the basics, especially the basics, the magnitude of the decline in unemployment, the rise in unemployment is captured. And relatively little happens in consumption, but more happens than actually happened. So there's more work to be done here. So consumption, so Greg can keep working. There's nothing here that says that Greg shouldn't do some more work in this area. His work has been very informative to date. And I think some of the ideas that are in his work are going to be part of that. And investment does very well at investment. The combination of Tobin and Jorgensen with sufficiently high adjustment costs matches investment in a GE model. Okay, let me stop there. So anyway, this paper is available on my website. I think it's in the book too, an early version of it. And it also, a jumping off point is my recent AER paper. So you can find out more then. But thank you very much for your attention.